Zara sat at her post on the bridge of the alien cruiser, watching the stars stretch out in the distance. The deep hum of the ship was a constant reminder of their journey through the silent vastness of space. Her eyes were trained on the console in front of her, a routine check of systems. When suddenly a flicker on the radar caught her attention, she blinked twice, expecting it to disappear. But it didn't. Instead, it pulsed once more, and then again. The signal was faint, but unlike anything she had ever seen before, it was irregular, like a pattern of something deliberate yet random. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she ran a quick diagnostic, wondering if it was a glitch, perhaps an anomaly in the cosmic waves. But the signal grew stronger, as if calling out to her. It wasn't just static, it was purposeful. Zara felt a sudden surge of curiosity. There had been stories back home of mysterious signals from ancient civilizations long gone, but nothing like this. This was recent. It was coming from a nearby star system. She leaned forward, her pulse quickened in her throat, a rising sense of excitement battling with her disbelief. She had always been skeptical of these myths. After all, her people had never encountered any form of intelligent life beyond their borders. Surely, if there were others, they would have found them by now, or so they had always said. Zara hesitated, her eyes darting toward the captain's chair. But the captain was busy giving orders to the crew, his back turned. She knew the captain was as skeptical as she was about such things. If she brought this to his attention, he would likely dismiss it as an error, yet something deep inside her told her this was no error, this was something real. She cleared her throat, and with a voice full of uncertainty, she spoke. "Sir, there's something strange on the radar." The captain turned his head, raising an eyebrow, and then walked over to Zara's station. He glanced at the screen before his expression shifted into something between intrigue and suspicion. He looked at the blinking pattern for a long moment without saying a word. Zara shifted uneasily under his gaze. Finally, he spoke. "Bring up the coordinates and send a transmission to the fleet. We are changing course." Zora's heart raced. She quickly complied, entering the coordinates into the system, her fingers trembling slightly as she did so. The ship's engines hummed to life. As they altered their trajectory, she couldn't help but wonder what they were heading towards, what was out there in the vastness of space that had been hidden from them for so long. As they approached the coordinates, Zora's excitement only grew. She could feel the tension building within her, like an electric current surging through the air around her. It was exhilarating yet unsettling. The unknown had always been something her species feared. After all, they had spent generations avoiding anything that might pose a threat to their peaceful existence. Zara swallowed hard. She knew the moment they arrived at their destination, it would no longer just be a mystery on a screen. It would be real. Whatever they found there would change everything. She could sense the other officers glancing nervously in her direction, and though none of them spoke a single word, she could feel their shared uncertainty in the air, a nervous energy that grew thicker with every passing second. It was almost as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The final calculations blinked on the console as Zara tapped a few keys. The proximity alarm went off, signaling that they had arrived, and then Zora's eyes widened. She gasped softly at the sight before them, a ship floating alone in the dark void of space. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, rough and worn, but unmistakably a ship. It was human in design. Zara had only ever heard about humans in the tales told to children back home. They were believed to be extinct, or perhaps just stories passed down from ancient times. But this was real, and it was right in front of her. Zara's heart raced as the ship floated before her eyes. It wasn't a trick or an illusion, it was real. The human ship looked like something from an ancient time, rough and battered as if it had been through countless battles. Yet there it was, hanging in the void of space, as if daring them to believe its existence. Zara stared at it in disbelief. She had never thought she would see a human ship with her own eyes, not after all the stories that had been passed down through generations of her people. The myths had painted humans as dangerous, unpredictable beings, creatures that had vanished from the galaxy long ago, or so everyone had believed. Yet here it was proof that humanity had survived in some way beyond what anyone had imagined. The captain of the alien cruiser walked over to Zara's station, his expression unreadable as he observed the human vessel. His voice was low when he spoke. "Bring us into range. Prepare a transmission." Zara worked quickly, her hands moving over the controls as her mind raced. She had studied the human myths and their so-called lost empire But never once had she imagined that something like this would be real. Surely this wasn't just some old relic drifting aimlessly in space. No, this ship had purpose. It was still alive. There was still someone aboard, and that thought made Zora's stomach tighten with anticipation. The captain's orders rang clear across the bridge, and within moments the alien cruiser maneuvered into position above the human vessel. The silence was almost suffocating as the crew waited for the next command. Zora held her breath, wondering what they would find when they boarded the ship. The transmission went out, but there was no immediate response. The human ship remained eerily still. The crew of the alien ship exchanged uncertain glances. No one knew what to expect next. Zora's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Were the humans still alive? Had they been living in isolation for centuries? Or were they a wandering remnant of some ancient past? All she could do was wait and hope that the humans would respond in a way that wouldn't lead to disaster. Finally, a response crackled over the communication system. Zora's eyes widened as a voice came through, loud and clear, a human voice, soft but clear. The captain leaned forward, listening intently. A new surge of excitement coursed through Zora's veins, but there was also a feeling of dread. Something about the voice sent a chill down her spine, yet she couldn't help but be captivated by the unfamiliar cadence of it. The words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight. It was a challenge, an invitation, a sign that humanity was still very much alive. The captain gave a sharp nod, his voice cutting through the tense air. "We are sending a boarding party. Prepare yourselves." Zora was chosen to join the team. Her heart fluttered as she followed the others down to the docking bay. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had ever been taught about humans was about to be shattered. There was no turning back now. As the airlock door hissed open and the boarding ramp lowered, Zora stepped onto the human ship for the first time. Her eyes darted around the narrow hallway, and her breath caught in her throat. This was no abandoned wreck. It was alive and waiting for them. The human crew was gathered in the next room, staring at them with wide eyes. Zora noticed their ragged clothing, the weariness etched on their faces, but there was also something more, something that sent a thrill through her chest. They had survived all this time, and they had done it alone. Zora stepped cautiously into the dimly lit chamber, her senses overloaded by the unfamiliar atmosphere of the human ship. The walls were made of rough, patched-up metal, the hum of old engines reverberating through the air. The human crew stood across the room, their gazes locked onto the alien visitors, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Zora could see the strain in their faces, the weight of years spent navigating the empty expanse of space reflected in their eyes. Yet there was something in their posture, something in the way they carried themselves that was undeniable. Human resilience. Captain Alex, the leader of the human crew, stood at the front. His appearance was unkempt, his clothes faded and worn, yet his stance was strong and confident. When he spoke, his voice was steady, though there was a hint of disbelief lacing his words. "We didn't think anyone was out there anymore," he said, his eyes scanning the alien crew. "You're not what we expected." Zora blinked, a strange sensation stirring in her chest. She had expected hostility, fear, or even anger from the humans, but what she saw instead was an openness that took her by surprise. For a moment, she found herself speechless, caught off guard by their apparent lack of aggression. The humans were meeting them with the same cautious curiosity that Zora felt herself. "We are not your enemies," Captain Alex continued, taking a few steps toward them. "We're just trying to survive, just like everyone else." Zora exchanged a quick glance with her fellow officers. They had all been trained to be wary of humans, to treat them as unpredictable and dangerous creatures. But standing here in the midst of the human crew, Zora could feel the weight of their survival, the raw determination in their eyes. She had heard stories of humans, of their endless wars and destruction, but none of those stories had prepared her for this moment. The captain gave a slight nod and gestured for them to follow him into a smaller, more private room. The human crew parted, making room for the alien visitors as they passed. Zora's mind was racing. This was not what she had imagined. The ship, the humans, nothing about it seemed like the terrifying force the stories had warned about. Instead, there was a quiet dignity in the way they moved, in the way they had kept going, day after day, surviving in a hostile universe. Once inside the room, Captain Alex motioned for them to sit. Zara took a seat, though she couldn't help but feel out of place in the midst of these survivors. The human captain didn't waste time with formalities. He launched straight into a story that left Zara in stunned silence. "We were part of a larger fleet," Alex began, his voice quiet but firm. "A long time ago, there was a war. We were scattered, separated from one another. And for years, we thought we were the last of our kind." His eyes flicked to the small group of humans behind him, all of whom wore expressions of quiet understanding. "But we survived. We adapted. And now, we're just trying to keep going." Zara couldn't hide her astonishment. She had known the humans had fought wars, but the way Alex spoke of it, the sense of loss, of perseverance, struck her in a way she hadn't expected. These weren't the violent, reckless creatures of myth. They were survivors, fighters, and more than that, they were survivors who had refused to give up even when everything seemed lost. There was a pause as the silence between them stretched, and Zara's mind began to churn with new questions. How had they managed to survive for so long? What had happened to the rest of their kind? But before she could voice her thoughts, the captain spoke again, this time his voice tinged with a trace of hope. "We may be scattered, but we're still alive. And now we have a chance to rebuild. We don't have much, but we've always made do with what we have. We'll keep fighting, just as we always have." Zara stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. These humans, this small crew, had endured so much and yet still carried hope. Something about it stirred something deep inside her. She had always been taught that her people were the pinnacle of civilization, that their technology and superiority made them the rulers of the stars. But here were these humans, small, primitive even, but stronger than anything she had ever expected. For the first time, Zara realized that the story of humanity wasn't just about survival. It was about finding a way to thrive even when the odds were impossible. And now she was beginning to wonder if her people had underestimated them entirely. Zara stood at the edge of the human ship's control room, watching as the human crew worked in a strange synchrony. Despite their worn and patched-up vessel, they seemed to move with purpose, each individual playing their part with focus. The hum of their engines reverberated through the room, but it was not the noise that filled Zara's mind. It was the overwhelming sense of survival that hung in the air. Suddenly, the sharp beep of an alert broke the silence, and Zara's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes quickly darted toward the control panel. Captain Alex had received an urgent transmission. His face hardened, and his brow furrowed as he processed the message. Zara could see the shift in his demeanor. The calm that had defined him earlier was now replaced by a subtle tension. "What is it?" Zara asked, her voice steady, though she couldn't help but feel her pulse quicken in anticipation. Alex turned slowly, his expression grave. "We've detected an incoming fleet," he said, his words clipped. "I don't know how, but they're closing in fast. We're not alone out here." The room fell silent as the reality of the situation sank in. Zara's mind raced. She had been so absorbed in the strange fascination with the human crew that she had failed to consider the bigger picture. The universe was still full of dangers, dangerous forces that didn't care about their survival, their struggles, or their resilience. Zara's stomach tightened as she realized that these humans might not be the only ones searching for them. "Who are they?" Zara asked, unable to mask the urgency in her tone. Alex's eyes were hard, his gaze distant as he studied the information on the screen. "They're hostile. I've seen their ships before. They're part of the same faction that wiped out most of our kind. They don't show mercy." Zara's mind spun. These humans, who had already faced the extinction of their species, now had to contend with another overwhelming threat. And worse, they were stranded in a ship that had no chance of matching the enemy's firepower. Zara felt a surge of unease. The overwhelming odds had always been her people's advantage, not the humans. They were supposed to be easy prey, a story of a dead civilization. And yet, Zara couldn't bring herself to believe that. "What's the plan?" she asked, despite knowing that she wasn't in command. She could see the glint of determination in Alex's eyes. He wasn't the type to give up. "We fight," Alex said simply, his voice unwavering. "We've been running from these bastards for years, but we've learned a thing or two along the way." Zara watched as the human crew began to prepare themselves with a focus that took her by surprise. They didn't panic. They didn't flee. Instead, they moved with a quiet intensity that was almost impossible to ignore. Zara couldn't help but be impressed by their ability to work under pressure. For a species that had been presumed dead for centuries, they seemed remarkably unshaken by the threat of annihilation. Alex turned back to Zara, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to need your help," he said, his voice low but clear. "You know their ships. You've fought them before." Zara swallowed. She had. Her people had clashed with this enemy before, and she knew how brutal they could be. But she also knew that her people had superior technology, superior ships, and the advantage in numbers. The humans had none of that. Yet something stirred within her. She had seen these humans survive against impossible odds. She had seen their will to live, to endure, to fight. And it was a force far more powerful than any weapon. She could feel her own resolve shifting, as if she, too, had become a part of something larger than herself. "I'll help," Zara said, her voice firm, though doubt lingered in the back of her mind. She had no idea what she was getting into, but she knew one thing for certain. If these humans were to survive, they needed every advantage they could get. As the crew gathered around, preparing for battle, Zara took her place alongside them. The room was electric with tension, but there was also an undeniable sense of unity. She was no longer just an outsider. She was part of their fight. And though she had no idea what the future held, Zara could feel a strange connection to these survivors, these humans who refused to die. The countdown to battle began with the eerie silence of the human ship's alert system ringing through the control room. Zara could hear her heartbeat in her ears as the crew scrambled to prepare for the incoming threat. The hum of the alien ship's engines felt louder now as the human crew worked with practiced efficiency. Despite the anxiety that gripped them, Zara had expected panic, but what she saw instead was an unyielding focus, a calmness that cut through the tension like a blade. Alex stood at the center of the room, giving orders, his voice steady and confident. "Prepare the engines, we need to evade them as long as possible." He called out to the crew around him. Zara had been briefed on the enemy, the aggressive warlords from a distant galaxy who had wiped out entire civilizations. With little regard for the lives they destroyed, she knew the danger they posed, and that even with the alien cruiser at their disposal, the humans stood little chance in a direct confrontation. Yet something in Alex's demeanor made her question that reality. He wasn't showing fear. He wasn't even showing hesitation. As the crew went to their stations, Zara could feel a sense of respect growing within her for these survivors who refused to bow to the impossible odds. "Zara," Alex's voice cut through her thoughts. "You've fought them before," he said. "Help us get to a position where we can strike back." Zara nodded as she moved to the control panel. She had trained in combat tactics before, but nothing like this. Fighting in a vessel that was practically falling apart on the inside, while facing enemies far more advanced than them. She quickly accessed the targeting system, pulling up the enemy fleet on her screen and assessing the ships with the practiced eye of a seasoned warrior. Each of the enemy vessels was heavily armed with weapons far superior to the human ship's outdated systems. But it wasn't the weapons that Zara was concerned with, it was their numbers. The enemy was massive, a fleet that had seen countless battles and was hungry for more. Zara's hands shook slightly as she plotted their course. "We won't make it far if we can't outrun them," Zara muttered to herself. She glanced over at Alex, who was standing beside her, watching her intently. His eyes were full of trust, and that made her feel more nervous than anything. She had never felt the weight of responsibility like this before, not for her own people, But for these humans, these survivors who had come to her aid when she had only seen them as weak. The enemy ships were coming closer now. The sensors on the ship started to beep with increasing frequency as the enemy locked in on their location. The first volley of fire from the enemy ships erupted in space, a brilliant flash of deadly energy that missed the human vessel by mere inches. Zora flinched, but kept her focus. There was no room for fear now. "Brace for impact," Alex shouted, his voice commanding as the ship jolted beneath them. Zora quickly input the evasive maneuver sequence, the ship's engines roaring to life as it lurched to one side. Narrowly dodging another burst of energy from the enemy fleet, the ship rattled under the stress, but the crew remained in motion, unaffected by the chaos around them. Zora's stomach flipped as the adrenaline hit her bloodstream. She was used to combat, but this was different. She was a part of something far bigger now. This wasn't just survival. It was a fight for everything these humans had left. The human ship bucked under the pressure again as another blast struck their shields. Zora could hear the hum of the shields straining against the impact, groaning as they held steady. She could see it in the faces of the crew. Each moment of survival was a victory in itself. Alex turned to her, his voice grim but full of determination. "We need to hit them hard," he said. "We can't afford to keep running forever." Zara hesitated for just a moment as the weight of his words hit her, but she knew what had to be done. She had fought these enemies before, and she had learned one crucial thing. When you're outmatched, you fight smarter, not harder. Without a word, she began to reroute the ship's power, boosting their weapon systems as she plotted a precise counterattack strategy. "Prepare yourselves," Zara called out to the crew. "We're going to give them something to remember." She locked the targeting systems onto the lead enemy ship and fired the blast shot forward, tearing through the enemy's shields and sending the ship into a spin as it took damage. The crew let out a collective cheer, but Zara knew this was just the beginning. The enemy was far from finished, and the fight was only starting. The human ship shuddered under another barrage of fire from the enemy fleet. Zora's hands gripped the controls with a white-knuckled intensity, her eyes darting across the monitors as the battle unfolded before her. The first shot she had fired had struck home, but the enemy wasn't about to retreat. The ships were relentless, their coordinated attacks showing years of battle-hardened expertise. Zara's pulse raced in her ears, and the walls of the human vessel seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of the explosions outside. Each second felt like an eternity. "Shields are holding," Alex's voice came through, steady yet strained as the battle raged on. He stood nearby, his eyes locked on the viewport, watching the enemy ships circle their vessel like vultures. But they won't last much longer. Zara's thoughts raced as she scanned the tactical map. The enemy's relentless pursuit left little room for evasive maneuvers. They were getting cornered. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the familiar thrill of combat coursing through her veins. But this wasn't just any battle. These humans, fragile by her people's standards, were fighting with a desperation she hadn't seen in ages. They had no advanced weapons, no massive fleet, no reinforcements. It was them against the universe, and yet they fought like they had nothing left to lose. "Zara," Alex said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. He stepped closer, his face grim but resolute. "We need something big, something unexpected." Zara's mind worked quickly. What could they do? What weapon did they have that could match the firepower of the enemy fleet? The answer hit her like a spark. She looked over at the human tactical officer, a young woman named Maya, who had been monitoring their power reserves. Zara could see the gears turning in her mind. "Boost the auxiliary power," Zara commanded Maya. "Redirect it to the engines. We're going to give them a fight they won't forget." Maya didn't hesitate. She punched a few commands into her station, and Zara felt the ship lurch as the engines roared to life, straining under the increased power. The ship jolted forward at high speed, an unexpected move that caught the enemy off guard. The alien fleet, not expecting such an aggressive maneuver, was slow to react. Zara grinned as the human ship broke through the formation, dodging another round of fire as they broke free from the enemy's immediate range. It was risky, but it worked. For now, they were out of immediate danger. "Now's our chance," Zara muttered under her breath. Her eyes locked onto the largest enemy vessel, the flagship. She knew that if they could disable the flagship, the rest of the fleet would crumble without its leadership. It was a gamble, but it was their only shot. Zara initiated a new strategy, rerouting their weapons to focus on precision strikes. The first shots slammed into the flagship's shields, sparking as the energy barriers flickered and failed under the onslaught. Zara's hands danced over the controls, giving orders to fire again, each blast directed with deadly precision. The crew watched in stunned silence as the human ship unleashed another wave of fire. The massive enemy flagship began to stagger, its engines flickering as it tried to regroup. Zara's heart beat faster as she saw the shields collapse. Now was the time. "Full power to the forward cannons," Zara ordered. Her voice was calm, but her pulse thundered in her veins. The human ship fired again, this time breaking through the flagship's hull. Sparks and flames erupted from the damaged vessel as it spiraled toward the edge of the battlefield, its weapons sputtering out of control. "Yes," Maya cried, her voice filled with a triumphant gasp. The crew let out a cheer, but Zara knew this was far from over. The enemy was not finished yet. The remaining enemy ships began to regroup, but their cohesion had faltered. Zara watched closely as they scrambled to reorganize. Their leader was down, and without its coordination, the enemy fleet's attacks became less efficient. "Keep pushing forward," Alex ordered. "They're weak. Let's finish this." Zara nodded, her hands already moving across the controls. She had seen the moment of victory, but she knew the fight wasn't won yet. The human crew had proven their resilience, their cunning, and their ability to fight when the odds were stacked against them. But there were still more enemies to face, still more battles to win. The human ship surged forward once again, its weapons primed and ready. The battle had shifted in their favor, but the true test had only just begun. The enemy flagship had been crippled, but the rest of the fleet still loomed like a shadow on the battlefield. The remaining ships, though scattered and disoriented, were still a formidable force. Zara could feel the intensity in the air, a palpable sense of impending danger that made every move feel critical. But she had witnessed something extraordinary in the past few moments, something that made her question everything she had believed about these humans. They were relentless, not just in battle, but in the way they faced impossible odds. Each person on board the human ship had fought as though their lives depended on it, because they did. There was no surrender, no second thoughts. They fought because it was in their nature to survive, no matter what the universe threw at them. It was something Zara had never fully understood, but now, standing alongside them in this fight, she felt a strange camaraderie that defied her upbringing. "We've crippled their leader," Zara said, her voice cutting through the tension. "But there's still more out there. We can't afford to underestimate them." Alex nodded, his face set in determined lines. He'd seen his people struggle for so long, fighting not just for survival, but for the future. And in this moment, Zara saw a flicker of something in him, something that spoke of hope. "We're not done yet," he replied. "We've got a chance now. We have to keep the pressure on." Zara wasn't used to this kind of thinking. Her people always had the upper hand, superior technology, greater firepower, endless resources. She had been taught that in every situation, they were destined to win. But these humans were different. They didn't have the advantages, yet they never faltered. They kept pushing, kept fighting, and they made her question her own assumptions. As the human ship charged forward again, Zara couldn't help but feel a growing respect for Alex and his crew. She had always thought of her people as the pinnacle of civilization, the strongest, the smartest, the most advanced. But in the face of adversity, the humans had something her people didn't. They had the will to fight against the impossible, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. "Zara," Alex said, breaking her thoughts. "I need your help. We have a window. If we can take out their remaining command ships, the rest of the fleet will fall apart. We've got to move fast before they regroup." Zara looked at the battle unfolding in front of them. The remaining enemy ships were rallying, regrouping in a formation that would give them a significant advantage if they had time to execute it. Zara's mind worked quickly, calculating the best course of action. "We need to isolate their command ships," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "If we can break them apart, we'll disable their coordination, and the rest of the fleet won't be able to follow." Alex's eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, she saw something in him that made her stomach twist, a quiet acknowledgement that they were in this together. "Do it," he said, his voice calm but full of trust. "We're counting on you." Zara took a deep breath. She wasn't used to this kind of partnership, this kind of reliance, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. With a few quick commands, she adjusted the course, rerouting power to the main weapon systems once again. The ship surged forward, cutting through the space between them and the enemy command ships. The human crew moved swiftly to execute the plan, each person carrying out their task with precision. It was beautiful, in a way, how they worked as one, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Zara couldn't help but feel a thrill of admiration for their unity. As the human ship neared the enemy command vessels, Zara initiated the strike. The main cannons fired in quick succession, each blast sending shockwaves through space. The first command ship exploded into a brilliant flash of light, its shields unable to withstand the force of the human ship's weapons. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she saw the second ship falter, its shields cracking under the pressure. It was working. The enemy was faltering. But Zara knew that this wasn't over. They still had one last ship to take down. The last remaining command ship would be their final challenge. If they failed, the enemy would regroup and retaliate with everything they had left. "We've got this," Alex muttered to himself, but Zara could see the steely determination in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting for survival now. He was fighting for a future. And that future depended on whether they could land the final blow. The human ship raced toward the last enemy command vessel, its engines pushed to their limits. The sounds of battle reverberated through the ship's hull, the whine of the engines, the crackle of energy blasts, and the rhythmic beeping of alert systems all blending into a symphony of chaos. Zara could feel her pulse quicken as they closed in on their target. This was it, the final moment that would decide the fate of the humans and their future. "We're almost there," Alex said, his voice tight with urgency. "Hold steady, everyone." Zara stood at the control panel, her fingers flying over the controls with practiced precision. The plan had worked so far, but the final enemy command ship was still a formidable adversary. It had more firepower than the other ships, more shielding, and a highly advanced weapon system that could easily tear through the human ship's defenses if they weren't careful. "Shields are at 50%. Maya, the tactical officer, called out. "We won't last long if we take another hit." Zara glanced over at Alex, her heart sinking. The situation was critical. The shields had already absorbed multiple hits from the enemy's relentless barrage, and the ship's hull was beginning to show signs of damage. If they couldn't disable the command ship quickly, they'd be sitting ducks, easy targets for the rest of the fleet. Alex met her gaze, his expression fierce but resolute. "We're not backing down," he said. "We'll finish this." Zara nodded. She had seen that determination in his eyes before. The humans had faced destruction and despair, yet they never gave up. It was this relentless drive to survive, to keep fighting, that had allowed them to reach this point. It wasn't just about technology or firepower. It was about their will to keep going, no matter the odds. The enemy command ship loomed large in the distance, its sleek, dark form threatening against the backdrop of space. It was larger, more imposing than the others, and it radiated a sense of power that was almost palpable. Zara knew that this was their moment. The moment when everything would either fall into place or shatter into chaos. "Fire everything we've got." Alex shouted, his voice filled with determination. Zara's fingers flew across the controls, activating the ship's weapon systems with a single fluid motion. The main cannons fired, the energy blasts streaking through space with pinpoint accuracy. But the enemy command ship shields flared up, absorbing the shots with ease. Zara's eyes narrowed. The shields were strong, but not invincible. They just needed one more push. "We need to get closer," Zara muttered to herself. She rerouted power to the engines, pushing the ship forward with everything they had left. The ship jolted as it accelerated, the control panel flashing warning signs as the engines strained under the added load. The enemy ship fired back, a massive energy blast that hit the human ship's starboard side, shaking the vessel to its core. Sparks flew from the console, and Zara stumbled for a moment, regaining her footing. The crew cried out in alarm, but Zara's focus never wavered. She couldn't afford to be distracted. "Status report," she barked. "Shields at 20%. Maya responded, her voice strained. "Hull integrity compromised. We can't take another hit." "Then we'll make it count," Zara said firmly, her eyes locked on the enemy vessel. The next shot would either destroy them or deliver victory. She wasn't about to let this be their last fight. With a deep breath, Zara initiated the final strike. She fired everything they had. The main cannons, the secondary blasters, everything. The human ship erupted with energy, and the blast shot toward the enemy command ship in a blinding burst of light. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, with a deafening explosion, the enemy ship's shields shattered, and the blast struck its core. The command ship staggered, its engine sputtering as it lost power. The crew aboard the human ship held their breath as they watched. And then, in a brilliant flash, the enemy vessel exploded. The blast sent shockwaves through space, and the debris from the destroyed ship scattered in every direction. The remaining enemy ships hesitated, their formation breaking apart in confusion. Without their leader, the fleet lacked the coordination it once had. One by one, the remaining ships began to retreat, their once unified attack now fragmented and disorganized. "We did it," Maya whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Zara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The battle was over. The enemy fleet was in disarray, and their last stronghold had been destroyed. Against all odds, they had won. Alex turned to Zara, his face breaking into a rare smile. "We couldn't have done it without you." Zara smiled back, the weight of the battle lifting from her shoulders. She had come to this crew as an outsider, but now, standing